Hey, one last intro from Toronto, Canada before I go. Today's episode is with Chris Dingwell, and I didn't know Chris Dingwell really at all before we started this episode, but he's a very interesting guy, been tattooing for a long time, and we talked a good bit about his painterly approach to tattooing and what he brings from his paintings to his tattoos. You might recognize Chris from the Wet Paint Project. That's how I knew of him really, which is a big part of the Hell City Tattoo Convention. If you've done any of the Hell City shows, you've noticed the Wet Paint Project where there are painters off to the side of the main tattoo room. And Chris runs that project and has for quite some time. So we don't talk a lot about that in particular, but we do talk a lot about his process, his background, and particularly the commonalities, the similarities that painting and tattooing have, and what you can bring from painting to tattooing. Side note: Chris is teaching a seminar on this exact topic, on this subject, at the Paradise Tattoo Gathering. So if you have not bought your tickets to Paradise yet, I hope that you will. I'd love to see you there. It's going to be a beautiful Jiminy Peak Mountain Resort in Massachusetts. You can learn more about it at tattoogathering.com. I'll make sure to link to that in the show notes, and we'll get started on this episode. Thanks.
Did you begin more as a painter, fine artist, or a tattooer, and how was your time split between the two? And then maybe we can bring that into how that whole wet paint thing started, because that's one of the cool, unique things about Hell City in my mind.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But are you ready to start recording?
Yeah, we're rolling. Yeah, let's go.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell what the hell's
Yeah.
I've been an artist for as long as I can remember. I started taking special art classes when I was in second, third grade. Started art school when I was in the fourth grade. Went on to get a master's degree. You know, it's just like the stupidest amount of art school you could possibly ingest. That was me. And the whole time that I was in art school, and I think, you know, to shorten it really briefly, like I went to undergraduate school. My degrees but both my undergraduate and my master's degree are actually in ceramics. I was predominantly a sculptor at the time, but I've always, even then, like even long before then, I've always been a multimedia artist. I did a lot of painting, a lot of printmaking. I did a lot of ceramics. I did glass blowing. I've taught all of those various things at different points many years ago. And I just always thought that when I went to graduate school, I was pretty intent on becoming an art professor. That was what I thought I was going to be doing. I got my very first tattoo from Brad Fink, and he was in his first, or maybe just barely into his second year of tattooing at Trader Bob's Tattoo in St. Louis, Missouri. And I met him through a friend of mine, went to town. I'd gone to undergraduate school in St. Louis, so I was connected to the town. Didn't know anything about him, the shop, anything about the process whatsoever. We were just talking about the event in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy from Gauntlet spent a lot of time talking about the book Modern Primitives. Are you familiar with that book?
I've heard of it. I've never seen the book.
So I was in undergraduate school from 1986 until 1990, and that book came out in 1989. And somehow, even in St. Louis, Missouri, I managed to cross paths with that book pretty much right in 1989. And I still have the copy that I bought then. And for anyone who doesn't know, it's a pretty infamous sort of underground book now at this point. It's been reprinted a bunch of times. It's relatively, I think it's still relatively available. It's not like out of print or anything. But there's a ton of history and a ton of different things going on in there. But what struck me the most in looking at, there's an interview with Leo Zulueta. There's an interview with Vivine Lizonga. There are several different interviews with other artists who at the time were doing what was considered like pretty radical artistic tattooing that was like, you know, like edgy and so forth. There's a lot of piercing in there and a lot of stuff about the rest of that culture as well. But as an artist, I'd never really crossed paths with tattooing. And like most of us, the little bit that I knew about tattooing was that it was just like these like, little knockoff sticker things that, was for sailors and whores and whatnot. And suddenly I was like, oh, fuck, that there's a world that might include me, or that I might be able to fit into. These fucking weirdos, like that's, like, wow, that I didn't even know that existed. So, I got my very first tattoo from Brad Fink, the summer before I started graduate school.
Okay. What year would that have been?
1991. Okay. I got it in the summer of 1991. Right in the midst of the first Gulf War. I wasn't living in St. Louis at the time. I traveled there to hang out with friends, got tattooed, and thought in the moment that it was going to be like the one and only tattoo I was ever going to get. But it just really sunk into me at the time. So when I started graduate school that fall, I was still working on some of the other stuff that I was doing, but I already started to work on drawings and ideas based on my artwork for getting my entire back tattooed, and that was my goal. And then the tattooing imagery started working its way into my sculpture. And what I ended up doing for my master's degree thesis was a series of a dozen life-sized ceramic sculptures of these like sort of little boy figures that were completely covered in these carved tattoo images from head to toe. And the carvings were really kind of they're more like woodblock prints. I'd done a lot of printmaking. I had a long, lot of experience with woodblock and linoleum printing. So the carvings were done in that style, but they were based in found images, some historical, some current, lots of political commentary, blah, 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 blah. In my 20-something-year-old mind, I thought I was changing the world and doing some radical shit, blah, 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 and all that. But I decided somewhere along the line, like, hey, I want to look like this. This is what I want to do. And to this day, I mean, it's been over 30 years since I got my first tattoo, and I still can't explain why. In my mind, just aesthetically, I was like, okay, I can get this one tattoo and it's going to like symbolize everything for me for the entire rest of my life. Or I can just get a complete bodysuit. But there was never really any in between for me. And looking back on that 30 years later, lots and lots of therapy later, I'm like, man, sure I'd do that again. But ironically, in the last couple of years, I've started like finally filling in some of the other patches and so forth. I'm actually really close to being done with my bodysuit, which is kind of, it feels fucking good. I feel really I'm in a space right now where I feel really rejuvenated about tattooing, because I'm starting to like finally complete that project after 30 fucking years. It's kind of weird. But yeah. As a side note, just weird side note, I designed this entire big ass back piece, which I don't have photographs to show you here, unfortunately, but it's basically like a big black sumi wash brush stroke that starts on my shoulder here, goes across my back, all the way down my ass and onto the side of my leg. And then within that brush stroke, I carved out these different images in sort of a woodblock style. And it ended up being like 100 hours worth of work. And I actually, it was done by a guy named Mike, who was working out of his basement with a homemade Spalding and Rogers kit in Columbus, Ohio. My entire fucking back was filled in with 6 flats. Yeah, yeah, buddy. And that's how I learned to tattoo. Like he taught me. I spent most of a year working with him, like every week, filling in more black, just filling and filling in. And um, eventually towards the end of it, he taught me what he could based on what he knew.
Was he self-taught?
He was pretty self-taught. He was an incredible artist, though. He was working for a company in Columbus at the time, and I met him in part through a friend, and in part ended up working with him briefly for some of the same companies. This guy, before computers and computer printing, he was part of a team of people who were hand painting billboards. So like you would never think of it nowadays because everything is computer generated, everything is printed, everything just like comes off the computer, bang, bang, bang. But even back then, still in the 1990s, anything that looked remotely photographic that was on a billboard was painted by hand on a sheet of canvas. And that's what he did. He did all these like super realistic billboard paintings. And he also did like the normal size sort of like illustrations. At one point, he did an entire calendar of photographic illustrations of vintage cars that were just fantastic,
Mm.
And at the time, like we talked about starting up a tattoo shop together, but it turned out he just kind of hated people and didn't want to deal with it. He was really happy, like tattooing part-time out of his basement, and like actually making a business out of it seemed kind of insane to him. And, in hindsight, 30 years later, I'm like, "God, maybe he was right." Like it was more fun for him,
Sure.
But I got the tattoo done. I got some other work done. And I just started collecting. I went to, because I was completely ignorant of anything and everything. I was like, oh, Ed Hardy just put out another book. That's cool. That's a cool book. Oh, he's going to be at a tattoo convention in Chicago. Like, back then there were like 6 tattoo conventions that year, like across the entire country. There were maybe 5 or 6 tattoo conventions all year. And I was like, well, fuck yeah, it's 6 hours away. I'm driving to Chicago. I'm going to go to the tattoo convention. And I had some photographs of the sculptures that I was working on, some in progress, some finished, whatever. And it's hard to imagine that this is even possible now, but I just walked right up to Ed Hardy while he was at his booth selling books and shit. I was like, hey, Ed, I like your new book. I like what you're doing. I can't remember exactly which one it was, but I think it was the exhibit that he had done at the Drawing Museum, where, in fact, I'm certain of this. I think it was the Drawing Museum. I want to say it was in DC. But the exhibit struck me in particular because it was specifically an exhibit of artwork that was done by tattoo artists, that was intended to show the art world what tattooing could actually be. And that and he was, he, of course, we all know he was one of the most important figures in sort of like kind of like bringing those two worlds, aspects of those worlds together. So that was a huge, enormous influence on me. And especially at that time, like he was really at the peak of doing that work. Like he was publishing a lot of books, doing a lot of it, exhibits, things like that. So I just walked right up to him like this fucking dumb kid with a grin on my face and was like, hey, check out what I did. And it was the funniest thing. I handed him a stack of like 35 millimeter photographs that I had printed out at the drugstore or whatever. And he's checking them out. And he's looking at it. Hey, these are really cool. I like these. And it just so happened at that moment, Guy Aitchison was walking past. And Ed looks up and was like, hey, Guy, come check these out. These are really weird. Like you got to see this. Like, this is pretty cool. Like, look what this dude is doing. Wow. No, I hadn't even started tattooing or even thought about tattooing at that point. So this is probably 1993, I guess, which is when I graduated. So it's probably early in 1993. And Guy comes over. He was just barely starting to like really get some national recognition for the biomech stuff that he was doing. And he was like, oh, these are really cool. I got to get one of these. And it sort of snowballed into this thing where he did a bunch of tattoo work on my right arm in trade for one of my sculptures.
Oh, nice.
And I got a chest piece started by a guy named Sonny Tufts in Philadelphia, also in trade for one of those sculptures. But it turned out that guy had a horrible drug problem that I didn't know anything about, so the tattoo never got finished. The sculpture disappeared. But that was my introduction into the tattoo world. Years later, I went out. Several years later, like 4 or 5 years later, I went out to San Francisco. I actually got a tattoo from Ed Hardy. I've been tattooed by Stan Moskowitz also several years later. So yeah, I mean, I do have this. I feel like I have this funny sort of tie to all of that, but I'm getting completely sidetracked, of course.
That's a really interesting kind of introduction. So when you first were introduced to modern primitives and got that first tattoo in St. Louis, and even the back, you were still in full professor mode. Like when you said, I thought, maybe these weirdos will accept me, you were thinking more as a tattooed person, not necessarily about getting into tattooing as a profession.
Yeah, but I mean, I was right on the cusp of that. I wasn't really thinking as a professor necessarily. I was just a podunk kind of student and so forth. But my years in graduate school, my 2 years in graduate school made me realize that whole system is really, really just impossible. There was and still is an enormous glut of people with art degrees. 90% of people who go to art school never use their art degree for anything. Coming out of graduate school, the job market was such that there were around 300 to 400 applicants for every one job available. And most of those jobs were short-term jobs, and you'd have to pack up your shit and move all the way across the country. And this is enormously long, like year-long process of like submitting slides and artwork and all of that just to be able to get the fucking job. And the job itself only lasts 6 months. You spend the entire time applying for the next job, and then the next one after that, moving across the country, and all of that sort of stuff. All that to make it, $30,000 a year, if you're lucky. Like maybe 10 years down the road, you'll get a solid full-time job. And so the first year after I got out of graduate school, I actually did get a job at the Columbus College of Art and Design. I was working as a technician in the ceramics department. So I wasn't teaching any classes, but I was like a glorified janitor. I oversaw some of the work study students. We made the clay, we made the glazes, we kept the place clean, ordered supplies and materials, shit like that. It was a full-time job. It required a master's degree. It was competitive. I was told that I was lucky to get in. My salary was $14,000 a year. Wow. That's like barely, and that was before taxes. Like I was barely taking $1,000 a month. I mean, it was Ohio in the 1990s. My rent was really cheap, and cost of living was vastly lower and all and that sort of stuff. But still, it was like, I might as well have been a greeter at Walmart, for all it took me to get there. And so that was when I started tattooing out of my house. Like Mike did it that way. Everybody, a handful of other people around were doing it that way. Columbus, Ohio at the time had 4 tattoo shops. And aside from Marty Holcomb, who I wasn't familiar with really until several years later, they were just traditional biker shops. All college kids were terrified to go into those places. And being on a college campus with 60,000 students, it was kind of a no-brainer. Everyone around me was like, well, you're good at art. You can do this. Just, shut up and do it. And I would do anything, anything anybody wanted for $50. And I was making so little at my job, like my actual day job, that like if I did 2 or 3 tattoos a week for $50 a piece, I was doubling my salary. So yeah, it was a no-brainer. It was an absolute no-brainer, and in the early 90s, there was hardly anybody tattooing. No one knew how to get into it. Certainly people that were doing like really artistic tattooing were extremely few and far between. So it was just, the timing of it was perfect. I have people reaching out to me all the time nowadays asking about apprenticeships and how to get into the business. And Jesus, fuck, excuse me,
Yeah.
good Lord, I wouldn't have the first idea of how to get into the business now, considering what it's turned into since. Like, I mean, I feel like I got into it in what seems to me to have been like, Wild West cowboy days, Um and and that's also part of what was really interesting to me about hearing those guys in New York talking about tattooing in the 1900s and the 1920s. Like that was like serious Wild West cowboy days, but at the same time those people were doing some impressive artistic tattoo work and really had some amazing business stuff going on, all sorts of stuff I didn't know about. Yeah. So
That's interesting.
none of which none of that has anything to do with what I'm going to be doing at Paradise.
Yeah. I would like to hit on that again because we were talking about that before we started recording the event in New York and the comment that you made about what we consider American traditional tattooing coming more from a era. Maybe revisit that again since we didn't get it on recording.
Yeah. So one of the things that's fascinating to me about, and this ties right back into what I was saying about, especially about coming across that book, Modern Primitives, and the effect that had on me as well as a whole generation of other tattoo artists. That book made a huge impression because it really opened a lot of people's eyes across the country to the idea that tattooing could be so much more than like traditional sailor tattooing. And at the time, people like Guy Aitchison and Marcus Pacheco and a whole bunch of other young artists, Paul Booth was just really starting to get a jump start on his career. All those guys were like super young. They were in their first years of tattooing then. Just a little ahead of me, and it was incredibly inspiring for me to see even 6 or 10 other artists around the country saying "fuck you" to that whole traditional thing. I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. You can get away with all of this other stuff, and so that's the world that I came into. And if I hadn't known from seeing that those things were possible, I probably wouldn't have gotten into tattooing because it wouldn't have appealed to me otherwise. What I found after being in tattooing for several years, that we ended up getting this kind of backlash, I think, where suddenly tattooing in general exploded in popularity, but also this idea of traditional tattooing, like bold lines, this, that, and the other thing, blah, 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 all that, like very rigid idea of traditional tattooing, bold lines, solid shading, 3 colors, blah, 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 blah. This is how it's done. This is the way it goes. That started really gaining a ton of momentum as well after I'd been in tattooing for like 4 or 5 years. And I was like, what the hell? So I've always sort of gone against that grain. So that the exhibit in New York, which was about George Burchett, and part of the reason I wanted to go is the biggest reason I wanted to go is because I've always been fascinated by George Burchett's drawings, because they're fine line, very detailed. He in his drawings he shows a lot of realistic animals and a lot of portraiture, things that I was doing and then learning to do in the 90s and the early 2000s that traditional bros were super opposed to. Like, you can't do that. That's never going to hold up. That can't possibly last. And I'm like, wait a minute. Like, here's this guy back in, 1890 to 1920. And we don't have a ton of photographs of the actual tattoo work. And even the photographs that existed then are really poor quality. So it's very hard to tell what the tattoos look like. But the drawings that he left behind make it really clear that he was very capable of doing that kind of stuff long before the 1940s came along. I was like, well, I want to go. I definitely need to find out more about this, right? And and that's basically what these guys were talking about. You know, they were saying like in Britain, that was at the time in the 1920s, that was the style, that was the fashion. There was a lot of fine line, there was a lot of highly detailed stuff. The guy from Manchester, England, who was speaking, talked about how there were other tattoo artists that are even better than George Burchett, and that like many people in the tattoo industry, Burchett became extremely well known in large part because he was a better business person. He was a better shucker and jiver. He was invested in all sorts of things. He was building a lot of machines, selling a lot of equipment, selling inks. He was basically stocking and providing like 35 other tattoo shops around London. Like he was the guy that everyone was coming to. So he made himself sort of the center of that. But they also talked about how these guys were all doing permanent makeup, which is something I had never known. Like they were really successfully doing like eyeliner and lip liner and cheek blush and all the permanent makeup that we think of as being like very highly technical nowadays. They were doing that shit in the 1920s.
Wow.
You know, like and so it really, really brought home to me this idea that like and I don't get me wrong, I love traditional tattooing. I really do. I love it for what it is, but I do think that a lot of modern tattooers, and I'm going to sound like an ageist prick for saying this, but a lot of young modern tattooers have taken on this mantra of bold will hold, and this is the only way things can be done. And it just crawls up my spine when I see some guy who's been tattooing for like 3 to 5 years telling some client online, like, oh no, you can't do that way. You've got to have solid lines and bold black and blah, 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 blah. And that'll never last. And you can't do this and you can't do that. And I'm like, bitch, I've been doing this for 30 fucking years, you know?
Yeah.
I recently had a client come in to get a new piece. I had done a tattoo on her over 10 years ago. And it's one of my all-time favorite tattoos. And I'll have to send you the photos of it later. But it's this epic Star Trek battle. It fills her entire upper arm. It's the Star Trek Enterprise flying through space, and this was it the Klingon warbird, and it's coming out of its cloaking. So it's like the front of the spacecraft is in really sharp focus. The back half of it is transparent, so you can see the planets and the outer space behind it. There's all these fucking laser beams and explosions and shit. And not only did this woman have like the most perfect magical skin to work on, but she sent me the most amazing perfect references to work from too. Like it was just and she sits like a rock. Like the whole thing came together just beautifully. But I did this fucking Starship Enterprise with like a million different colors and every single little tiny window and all these laser beams and explosions and so forth. My friend Mike, who's working with me now, Mike, part of the reason this conversation's come up for me a lot is that Mike came to me because he's been an artist and an illustrator for many, many years before he started tattooing. So he's about my age. He's in his early 50s. But he's only been tattooing for like about 6 or 7 years, and he was apprenticed under a guy who was really, really rigidly traditional, and then he worked at a shop for about 4 or 5 years that was super, super traditional. And we have these funny sort of banter back and forth because he came to me wanting to work with me because he's like, I feel like I'm really in a rut with this traditional thing. I need to get out of that. I really want to work on my own. I want to do my own thing. But then every time we start talking about tattooing, he's like, well, you can't do that. You need the bold lines. You need this, you need that, you need the other thing. And I'm like, oh my God, Mike, like he's so indoctrinated into that. Like, so he's been working with me just over a year now. So I'm working on like really like fucking prying his brain open, like let this like fresh air in. Right? So I brought him in to see this Star Trek tattoo that I'd done. And I was like, check this out. Like, look, all this color, all this shading, all this other stuff. And he was like, oh my God, like that orange is as bright as day and like whatever. And then I was like, you know what? That fucking thing is over 10 years old. He just like his eyes just like that huge. He's like, I can't believe it. Like, you know, the orange is still solid as day. The whites are still solid as day. And then he makes this comment and he's like, well, you know, of course, at least it has all that black in there to hold it together. And I just rolled my eyes and I was just like, oh my fucking God, dude. Like he can't let go of that idea. I didn't say anything. I went on tattooing. I was working on the woman's chest and I kept staring at the Star Trek thing all day. And I looked at it and I realized as I looked at it, I brought him back in and I said, take a look at this tattoo, Mike. You tell me which colors are holding up the best. And he's like, oh, he's looking at it. He's like, I still can't believe that orange and those whites and these colors and that colors and blah, 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 blah. I'm like, okay, so which part of the tattoo is really not holding up as well as the rest? Like the whole thing looks really good, but it's not. I mean, it's a 10-year-old tattoo. And this is a woman who's had 2 children. She's gained and lost weight. Like things have happened to her body, like natural sort of stuff, right? And he's like, well, I don't know. Like maybe what about this and maybe what about that? And I was like, look at the black, Mike. Look at the outlines. Like, and I looked at the tattoo myself and I realized like the part that held up the least in what I did, I was like, if I was going to go back and do anything to that tattoo to like really fix it up or polish it up or bring it back to life, which I don't think it needs, but in theory, is the black. My outlines were pretty shaky. A lot of them had turned kind of gray. The whole, she's larger than she was when I first tattooed her, so the whole thing's a little bit bigger than it was before. But in all honesty, the colored pigments that I put in 10 years ago are more solid and more saturated in the skin than the areas of black that I had put in. Now, maybe that has a lot to do with my particular tattooing style and the way that I approach things. But I do a lot of black and a lot of outlining prior to layering color into my tattoos. I do have a sense of I do have a belief in the idea that the outlining in the black really does do a lot to hold any tattoo design together, even if it's photographic or realistic. But I said to Mike, the only thing that really determines whether or not a tattoo is going to hold up over time is whether or not your skin actually holds on to those pigment particles and how well your skin holds on to those pigment particles. Now, how a person takes care of their skin has a big impact on that. As we all know, too much sun is going to ruin any tattoo. Varying human genetics are going to make that different. I've had clients whose skin just doesn't seem to hold up at all. And some clients like this woman whose skin is amazing, and then everywhere in between. But your skin cells don't have any idea what color that pigment particle is. They don't know, and they don't care. So this whole notion that black is the only pigment that's going to stay, I think is actually just completely false. I think what it stems from is the fact that in the 1940s and going all the way up into the 1950s and 60s and even into the 90s when I started tattooing, a lot of the colored pigments that were available either weren't as solid or they weren't produced as well because the people making them didn't really understand like entirely how the pigment particles stay in the skin or why they stay in the skin. There's a whole bunch of tattoos that I did in the all the way up into the late 90s up into like the early 2000s where all of the orange is just completely gone.
Yeah.
Just gone, because I was using them the can't remember the name of the company.
Stabrite or one of the
It wasn't Star, but it was Phil somebody or other was making pigment out of Texas, and Guy Aitchison was like, you got to use this stuff, like whatever begins with a P. It wasn't Premier or Perma something. I don't.
Yeah.
It was. Yeah. It was everybody was using back in 1997, right? And I've had plenty of conversations with other tattooers. They're like, oh yeah, you like that stuff? Yeah, the orange disappeared, didn't it? I'm like, yep, sure as hell did. Yeah.
Sure
but
did.
the pigments that we have available to us nowadays they're just scientifically vastly better than what was available back then. Like the stuff. I mean, I work almost entirely with Eternal, which has been around for a really long time. I remember somebody explaining to me exactly why Eternal's pigments were so great when they first came out, because they had been working with companies in the Detroit area who had all this incredibly high-tech equipment that had been used for making automobile paint for the auto industry. But the auto industry was dying and those companies needed work. And so Tramp from Eternal approached them and was like, hey, I want to use your equipment to make some tattoo ink. And they were like, fucking yeah, hell yeah, come on. So that tattoo ink was just much better refined.
Yeah.
And that means that the particle size is better. So it's more filtered and it's more accurate. If your pigment particles are too small, your skin's just going to carry that away. It's going to end up in your lymph nodes or your spleen or your whatever your blood system. It's just going to get carried away if it's really small. If it's too big, that's what causes a lot of the what we think of as an allergic reaction or an irritation. Your skin gets really angry and irritated and pushes it out through the surface. It gets all inflamed and then the color falls out. I don't remember who it was, where I learned this or who explained this to me several years ago. It was, I want to say like 10-ish years ago. But the bottom line is that particles which stay are the ones that are precisely the right size for your skin cells to sort of accept it and hold on to it and keep it there. And so, yeah, like whatever the particle is, it's going to stay if it's the right size particle, if it's the right kind of particle that's not irritating, what have you. But the skin doesn't give up what color that particle is. You know, it doesn't have to be black. It doesn't have to be, and you don't have to have a big, thick, wide line like this because everything that's happening in your skin is actually happening on a cellular level, right? It's not happening on this like big, thick draw. Like your drawing style doesn't really, like your skin doesn't give a shit about your drawing style, right? The primary biggest reason that traditional sailor tattooing in the 40s became really simplified. And I've thought about this and kind of known this for a long time, but the guys in New York really touched on this a lot as well. It like leading into the 1940s around World War II, a lot of those designs became simpler and simpler and simpler simply because those guys were in a position where they had to crank out as many tattoos as quickly as they possibly could. And that's it. You know, you've got 400 sailors that come off of a boat. They've got 24 hours to get drunk, get laid, and get tattooed and get back on that boat and go out to sea. You need to be able to do those tattoos as fast as you possibly can. Right. The best way to do that is to simplify those designs down to their most basic elements. And this is where this is the thing I think is most fascinating about traditional tattooing. And it's the thing that I love because traditional tattooing, like really good traditional tattooing, is incredibly difficult to do. And it's incredibly difficult to draw because you have to be able to take this idea, simplify it down to its most basic elements, but every single one of those elements has to be just perfect. Everything's got to be really elegant. Everything's got to flow really nicely, and it's got to look spectacular in its most minimum form. That's not at all easy to do. And there are so many kids out there cranking out little neo-trad stuff and little traditional tattoos that like ultimately are like they're good, but they're kind of awkward. You know, like there's a huge window of like really good, like fairly good to pretty good to even like really good traditional tattooing, but the amount of like really amazing traditional tattooing that's just fucking nails it, very, very small. And I can't do it. Like that's totally not my thing. Like I'm the worst at that. Like I'm not a minimalist. I'm a maximalist, and I always have been. So,
yeah, I agree, and I have the same problem. You know, not only the to your point, the shape design, all the elements need to be simplified and need to work beautifully together, but technically it has to be executed so perfectly and in your style and in mine as well. There's a lot of wiggle room for me. I never finish a tattoo in a single session, so I always get a chance to come back and tent something this way or push that or pull that. So yeah, it's a completely different game, and I'm terrible at it too. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, I think that's another thing that's really lost on a lot of these guys that are kind of pushing this sort of traditional bold will hold is the only kind of way, is that like those designs were also created for a culture where those guys were going to come off that boat, get drunk, get laid, get tattooed, and leave, and you were never going to see that person again. Like whatever you got done that day, that's all you got done. Like you never had a chance to see that again. Those guys almost hardly ever even saw what their tattoos looked like when they were healed up. Like they didn't know. And nobody was paying by the hour. Everybody was paying by the piece. Tattooing back then was a blue collar job. Even in the 1920s, the guys were talking about how like almost none of the tattooers back then were really making a living full time tattooing. Right? They were doing sign painting and tattooing and running barber shops. Like they even talked about Burchett and his the fact that he was doing cosmetic tattooing and so forth. Like he had to do that to sort of supplement his income, because there were dry periods where the sailors weren't around. So he would literally move to a different studio in a different part of town just to do like permanent makeup on all these upscale ladies. And then he'd go back to the sailors when the sailors came back in town, like going back and forth just to be able to like piece his living together.
That's so interesting. I had no idea that permanent cosmetics were happening that long ago. I thought it was
I didn't either. I had no idea. Or at least that they were really popular. Like I've definitely seen a few things here and there, like where somebody got this done or somebody got that done, but I always kind of assumed that it was really unusual, or it was remarkable for somebody to do that. At any rate, a circle way back. I started when I started tattooing, like I said, I came out of art school. I've been a painter for, printmaker, whatever. I've always worked with like sort of more elaborate processes. I'm more of a maximalist. I always have been. What the irony is that like the one thing I never really learned in all my years of art school was how to do was drawing. I was never very good at drawing. Because I had my hands in so many other different kinds of things. I did a lot of collage. I did a lot of assemblage. I did a lot of stuff with the images. I was doing all of that kind of stuff. But I never really. I definitely took classes. I learned drawing, but I would never have said that I was like that was like my best skill. And tattooing completely kicked my ass. But also, I started tattooing out of my house. I had like a week's worth of like, hey, try this, try that. Oh, looks like you're doing good. Good luck. Slap on the back. Mike was going to go up and make dinner and hang out with his kids, and he just kind of let me like do whatever on these people in his basement. But like for the most part, I was just alone, fucking around, figuring it out. And so I was like, well, fuck, like I knew from day one that I was doing terrible tattooing on a technical level. But I was like, okay, well, how can I fake my way through this? Like, and I started doing these designs and like a little edgy, scribbly, scratchy sort of stuff to them and like some shaky, whatever. And I was like, I can fake my way through this by doing all this like kind of layering and scribbling and blah, 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 blah. I can make it look cool. Right. And that's basically what I've been doing for 30 years. Fucking faking my way through it. I've never thought of myself as being like the best technical tattooer. But that's really led me to where now, where like you were saying earlier, like almost all of the projects I do, hell, even black and gray projects that I do, if it's at all possible, I prefer to do them in a couple of sittings, in a couple of layers. I really want to be able to, just like you would if you were doing an oil painting, like you want to put down a layer of paint, let that dry, let that set up, and then go back and like really layer some glazes or transparencies over it, things like that. These are all things we can do with tattooing nowadays that clients will not only allow us to do, but they're psyched for it and they're willing to pay for it. Like nobody was sitting down in the chair paying $200 an hour back in the 1940s wanting to get like full day's worth of stuff, like we're relative to the 1920s, most of us who are working professionally, even at a basic level, are making vastly more money. So many of us are able to make a living full-time tattooing. Like I said, I started tattooing out of my house that one year that I had that full-time job, and it only took me a year to be able to quit my day job and start tattooing full-time, and that's what I've been doing ever since, like, with basically no training and nothing but some, like, homemade equipment. And I just, like, fucking scrambled and did, clawed my way up. I got into a shop eventually in Ohio, and I ended up going to conventions and doing stuff and learning things. Connecting with other artists in a way that I think was easier at the time than it is now, because it's so vast, so many people. But I still like to work that way. So the seminar that I'm going to be teaching, the seminar that I'm going to be working on, is really all about those sorts of things: how to build colors up in layers, how to do stuff with, how to create painterly techniques in a tattoo that are non-traditional. And I'm going to be focusing a lot on how that affects doing cover-up work in particular, because the biggest thing that's different, and it's completely different, about working in layers in a tattoo versus doing a painting, is that with a painting, of course, your layers are literally physically on top of each other. With any tattoo, no matter what it is, you're always working into the same layer of skin. That amount of pigment is all held in the same layer of skin. So, like, I tell people all the time, even the term cover up is really misleading, because you can't just cover that old tattoo. And 90% of the photographs that we see of cover up tattoos online, they're misleading as well. Even the ones that I post of my own work are misleading, because when you have that old tattoo, all of the pigment from the old tattoo sits in the second layer underneath the surface of the skin. When you put that new layer in, bam, that ink is saturated not only into that second layer underneath, but it saturates into the top layer above it as well. And that top layer appears to completely cover up the old ink that's underneath here. But what you're actually doing when you do that is this layer is going to peel off when it heals. And what you're actually creating underneath is a blend of the new pigment with the old pigment. So you have to understand color blending in pretty much the same way that a painter understands color blending in order to really effectively do cover-up work. So, like, the simplest example is that, like, someone comes in and they've got this black tribal thing that they got back in the 90s. In their mind, it's black. And in a lot of tattooer minds, it's just black. But if you actually look at that pigment in the skin, it's pretty gray most of the time. I mean, unless that tattoo is only 3 or 4 years old and been done really well by a professional, that ink is pretty gray, and it's often really not fully saturated. A traditional tattooer would say, well, you can't put yellow on top of black. And that's true only if your expectation is that by putting yellow on top of black, you're going to get yellow. Because of course you're not. But if you can take that old black and turn it into a leaf, and you pack yellow on top of that old black, and because you understand painting and how that blending works, that yellow and the black together are going to heal up to, like, some sort of an organic, muted looking green, then you can use that to your advantage. You can use a lot of different colors to lighten up the old pigment that's underneath. You can also use a lot of texture to camouflage the old texture of the tattoo. And that's one of those places where I think that traditional approaches to tattooing fail the most when it comes to doing cover-up work. Excuse me. Because you have to stay outside of the box. And you have to think about all the different ways that you can lighten up the old tattoo work, but also all the different ways that you can kind of trick the eye and fool the eye. And you have to be aware of negative space in the old tattoo. I think in particular, that's something that especially gets forgotten. I've seen people get like, they have like a thin line of script, for example, that's just lettering that they want to have covered up. And an artist who's not aware of negative space is likely to look at that lettering as its own single shape and just block it out with a big block of dark color. When really most of that lettering is the open space between the lines, and it's all empty skin. That empty space is opportunity to put lighter colors into. Using texture in your design, even just a little bit of scumbly random texture can camouflage an old tattoo incredibly. Whereas if you have like a really traditional design, whether it's an American traditional or Japanese traditional design, those designs are, because they're very crisp, very graphic, very minimum, every line, every bit of shading has to go in exactly the right spot. And half of that tattoo is actually bare skin. If those lines don't line up exactly perfectly with the tattoo underneath, that tattoo underneath is going to show through completely. I can't tell you how many times I've seen gorgeous, beautifully, masterfully done Japanese back pieces, for example. And then you look at the right shoulder blade or the left shoulder blade, and it's just a big black cloud. And the whole rest of the back is fantastic, From a mile away, it's like, oh, it's a cover-up. Any tattoo that's got like a big dark blob of black that's like really, really dark, from a mile away, it screams a cover-up. And this is what I tell my clients. If you get this tattoo covered up and people look at that tattoo and go, well, that's really cool, but what's under there? If they're always asking you what's underneath that, then you still are living with that old tattoo. You haven't actually made it go away. That person still has to explain, yeah, I got this thing in high school, it's my girlfriend's name or whatever, or you can make up your own story, whatever, that's always fun to do. But if you have to constantly explain what's underneath your old tattoo, underneath your new tattoo, then that cover-up is a failure to me. It's just a failure. So when I approach a cover-up, the very first thing I'm going to try to do with that piece is I'm going to try to do two things. I'm going to try to pack as much light color as I possibly can into the darkest areas of the old tattoo. But then, assuming, let's say you've got a piece this big and you're covering it with something this big, you've got a lot of space around it that's just bare skin. I'm going to try to put as much dark area into that empty space around it so that you don't end up with that like dark blob in the middle of something that's otherwise really bright and beautiful, right? Balance it all out. Learning to sort of understand that balance, learning to kind of create that sort of underpainting and then layer the color in on top of it makes it so much more possible to get rid of something that's really old. And that's where I really, really started to think about, because I've been doing cover-ups forever, and I'm definitely the go-to guy in my town and around this area. Like, I have lots of other artists in the area who, in fact, I just did one the other day where this guy came in with this piece that had really thick black outline, and he had gone to somebody else in town who does beautiful, beautiful work, but not cover-up work. And they had said, well, I can definitely cover that, but you're gonna have to get the whole thing lasered substantially, and laser treatment is great. I'm really glad that it exists, but it can take years. It's prohibitively expensive for the majority of clients. And it's excruciatingly painful. I've been there, I've done that. I had a ton of laser work done on my left arm. My entire left arm is all cover-up work. I've been on both sides of that needle. If there's a way that I can cover up someone's tattoo without making them go to a laser, I'm going to do it. And 99% of the time, I can do that. The only times I've really ended up telling someone you're going to have to get that lasered is not because I can't cover up their tattoo. It's because I can't cover it up with what they want to get done. If what they want to get done is like super light, delicate, feminine, airy, pastel-y, and nothing else whatsoever, then, like you're really limiting things, I've had people come to me, for example, with solid full color tattoo projects, and they're like, I want to cover this up with something black and gray. And I'm like, that's not how black and gray works. There is, however, I have a whole series of photographs of a project that I did just like that. This woman insisted on black and gray. And I was like, okay, well, I can do that, but I can do that using opaque grays. And one of the really interesting parts about that project is that there were parts of the old tattoo that were really orange and really warm color. And then there was a lot of background that was really blue. So it was a really cold color. I did a whole passive opaque gray over the whole thing using a pretty neutral opaque gray. And the color largely went away, but that warm and cool contrast remained. So the gray ended up being really cool gray in one area and really warm gray in another area. What I ended up having to do in order to balance that out, and this was a great exercise and really interesting to me, was that I went back into it with a second passive opaque grays, except that I mixed up a really warm gray, which I put on top of the cool areas in order to neutralize them. And then separately, I used a really cool bluish gray, which I put on top of the orange to neutralize those. And that actually ended up healing up. I mean, it still looks very like opaque gray, and there are some variations in the grays and so forth. But it balanced it out in a way that healed up and survived. Yeah. But you can't do that if you don't understand at least the basics of color theory and like complementary colors, like blue and orange are complementary colors. That means that if you mix them together, they cancel each other out and they turn into what's referred to as a neutral gray. And that's just a basic painting principle. Most tattooers don't really learn about that sort of stuff. That's like freshman art school stuff. But most tattooers don't necessarily get that. Or if they do, they're doing it in a way that, like Guy Aitchison, for example, and a lot of that other biomechanical stuff, an enormous part of what makes that stuff work when it's in color is that there's almost always that like hot against cool color contrast. You've got all these big purple forms and hooks swarming in front of this intense orange bright background, that creates this like really intense contrast. And I think a lot of people understand warm cool contrast in that sort of context. But being able to understand it when you're working with very muted, neutral, vintagey kinds of colors or funny blends of colors, that kind of thing. That kind of thing is really important as well. And it's also something that even if you're like, it can be really useful to know and understand, even if you're not covering up an old tattoo. So, I mean, that's it.
Yeah, the tendency that people have to darken with black and lighten with white rather than going to a complementary to neutralize before they hit their blacks and whites, I think is something that a lot of tattooers could could learn a lot from. It's funny that you're describing that tattoo, and I had a really similar experience of covering kind of a hot rod flames with a full black and gray sleeve, and ended up doing something really similar where I convinced the client to that it would read as black and gray if we tinted those yellows towards purple, put like a very soft grayish purple over the yellows, and so we ended up with this kind of muted purple and green black and gray sleeve. And at a first glance, healed, it reads as a black and gray tattoo. You really have to look at it for a minute to realize, like, oh no, that actually tints more towards a mossy green, and that tints more towards a really muted purple. But it's not obvious from the start.
No, and the thing is, I think the other thing too is that, like, I don't remember who it was that said this. It was some incredibly, amazingly talented West Coast traditional tattooer, and this is something I read in a magazine 20 years ago. This guy said, that the tattoo's only good if you can read it from across the room in 3 seconds flat. And this guy's amazing. He's talented. I fucking loved his work. And I hated that idea. And I still hate that idea. Because the person you're doing the tattoo on is going to live with that for the rest of their life. And I have clients that come back to me and look at my work, and like 10 years later, they'll be like, oh my God, I still see new different things in this. I see things, I see it differently every day. And what you're describing about the piece that you just did is a perfect example of that. Like, at one moment, it looks like it's black and gray, and then you get up on it, and you're like, oh my God, it's so much more intricate than that. It's so much more complex than that. That's amazing. And, when we look at art, capital letters, art in museums and galleries, that's the stuff that sucks us in. That's the stuff that makes us want to, like, walk right up to that canvas and really spend some time with it and really check it out. Like, oh my God, like the details, the brush strokes, the colors, like, and it looks like this, and you look at it from different angles. You come back to it 2 weeks later, you have a totally different experience of it. Like, to use a super generic example, like the Mona Lisa is enigmatic because people have been seeing it differently for, 400 years or something like that. Nobody's tattoo is going to last that long. But if you give something to somebody in tattoo form that they're going to be able to really thoroughly enjoy for their entire life, you've really fucking done something. If you've given something to them where all of the questions are answered, like, from across the room within 3 seconds, and there's nothing left for them to see or to figure out, then that's it. You're done.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think even that guy's statement, I think, and I'm going to go back to what I was saying earlier about the actual complexity of traditional tattooing. I think this guy, I think what that guy said, I don't think he even realized that he was severely oversimplifying what he himself does. Because even with an amazingly well done, really well thought out traditional tattoo, you don't get it all in those 3 seconds. You've really got to spend some time to realize, like, just how perfect all of that stuff is. You're going to recognize that's a heart, that's a panther, that's a whatever it is. You're going to see that part from across the room, sure. But the perfection of those details and the perfect balance of color and form and line that goes into, like, a really amazing piece, even in a really good traditional tattoo, that's going to last you a lifetime. But if it's a ho-hum traditional tattoo and you don't get any of that extra layering, and all you get is, like, the thing that's, like, that you get in the first couple of minutes, then what?
Yeah. I think it's maybe somewhere in between. I certainly want my tattoos, the arrangement of dark and light shapes, to be interesting enough from across the room to grab people's attention. Now, whether or not they know what the imagery is, well, I don't really care about that, but I at least wanted to grab their attention enough where they go like, well, what is that? That's crazy, and get closer.
Well,
and
that's the whole point. The whole point is that you want to draw people in. One of the things I wanted to point out, that goes right into one of the things I wanted to point out, which is that, and this is a really funny story. I went with a whole bunch of years ago. I went down to New York with to Long Island and did a weekend of painting. Excuse me, with Corey Kruger and Keith Caramello. He was hosting it at his shop, and a handful of other people. And this is something that I found is really funny. And I think this is funny because I've seen it in a number of really amazing tattooers that I've known. Like Nick Baxter's a good example. Corey Kruger's certainly an amazing example. And even Keith was doing this, and my friend Matt has done this out years ago. A lot of tattooers who've really gotten interested in painting and taken an interest in painting and spent a lot of time really studying like Renaissance techniques and masterworks and things like that. I went to art school. I've got a master's degree. These guys barely made it out of high school alive, right? So I get into the room and Keith is doing this thing and he's working on this underpainting for this big painting he's doing, and he's going on about how well, this is my grisaille. And I was like, what the fuck is that? He's, well, that's Italian. Italiano, fragile. Grisaille simply means underpainting. But I learned this term and this technique from Keith Caramello, right? Tattoo guy from Long Island. But this is something that I've used in my tattooing for years before I met him, before I even knew the name or the term for it. And when I went through art school, we just called it an underpainting, right? But very specifically in the Italian Renaissance, when they started doing more realistic and almost photographic looking sorts of paintings, the grisaille, which was the underpainting, was typically done either in black and gray or in a sepia tone, but it was all monochromatic. And this is the part that's really important, which is that, and this is, interestingly enough, this is exactly what traditional tattooers have been saying all along. Okay, so keep up, right? What's important about the grisaille, what's important about the underpainting is that the thing that makes your imagery hold up the most visually is value contrast, your lights and your darks and your light sources. So a traditional oil painter in the Renaissance technique would create the entire layout as a black and gray painting, almost the same way that we would create a black and gray tattoo now. And I've heard people say that. The thing is that if everything is held together the right way with your black and gray, your colors are actually irrelevant. You can paint those different parts any different color that you want to. In fact, I've seen examples of people who study and do color theory projects where they'll do the exact same underpainting 3 different times and then overpaint that with 3 completely different color schemes, but the image still holds up, right? When I'm working on most of my projects, I will do a complete black and gray underpainting in my tattoo work. And that's not something that's I didn't come up with that. I didn't invent that. Guy Aitchison did that when he first tattooed my arm. And that's a piece that's based on largely traditional Japanese stuff. It's really funny to show people this tattoo because it doesn't look anything like a Guy Aitchison tattoo. People will ask me oh, who did your arm? And I'll go, oh, some guy in Chicago. I'm like, oh, cool, whatever. And they're gone, right? The same person comes up, asks me oh, who did your arm? And I'm like, Guy Aitchison. Oh my God, let me see that. Let me look at that. Oh my God, they're turning my arm around and twisting it out of its socket. They want to see every little part and piece. And I'm like, it's so not. I love it. It's beautiful for me. I really appreciate the experience of it. It's not even remotely a Guy Aitchison and tattoo at all. just having that base layer of black, gray, and everything underneath, like it really does hold the whole image together in a way that that um that a lot of people who just start with color don't really do. So or don't really you don't really perceive. Like it's really easy when you just start with color and nothing else, and you try to do everything all at once. It's really easy to get lost and lose that structure. So I think one of the other things that I think is really interesting to me about where tattooing has gone, and we've seen this for the last 10 years or so. It's not like new there, but like particularly, I think one of the things that's become incredibly common is for people to do all of their creative work on their iPad, and they're mostly using Photoshop kind of techniques and so forth, taking found photographs, collaging them together, creating this completely and totally sorted out, fully rendered, fully colored design on the iPad, and then show that to the client. And I get it. Like you show something like that to the client, it's fucking spectacular. Like, you're kidding. You're going to put that on my arm? Hell yeah, let's do it. Right. I would be doing that too if I had the Photoshop skills to do it, but I just don't. But then what happens is that I sit down and I watch these videos of these guys tattooing, and they're like a fucking typewriter or like a dot matrix printer. Like they put the stencil on with the stencil stuff. I hate that shit, right? Like the stencil stays on forever. Like you can't get rid of it, right? Like that's the whole idea, right? I hate that. I hate having the stencil on there. Like, well, like my goal is to get rid of it as fast as possible, right?
Yeah.
Because because I'm doing this completely differently. Like they'll sit there and they'll start at the bottom and they'll just like tick their way up, like every single solitary color, every single shade, every single whatever, and they can perfectly replicate what they've done on the iPad. And it's striking. It starts being it's an incredible skill. And I'm not even saying that the people who are working like that don't understand the artwork that they're creating. I don't want to imply that at all, because I think the best ones clearly do understand the artwork. But as a tattoo artist, trying to work that way for me would be so painfully tedious that I would hate. If you see someone get halfway through the tattoo and the tattoo's like half finished, like, oh, we got to fit for today, and then the stencil, it's like half blurred out. Like, how the fuck are you gonna put that back together? Like, like, what are you gonna do with that? Like, oh my god.
I've always thought that same thing. Yeah, it stresses me out when especially the ones who do the really intricate, overly rendered stencils where they have every transition like a topographical map on a forehead. I'm like, I can't read that at all. I have no idea what you're. Yeah.
I mean, I'm known for doing incredibly elaborate stencils myself. Like I like with all kinds of fine-tuned itty bitty teeny weeny shit in there. But my tattoo process generally is that for the most part, cover up or not, I'll start with a really fine little 3-needle outliner, and either with black or a variety of grays, I'll just really quickly sketch in the design so that the whole design is laid out. And then I'll work over the whole thing, like building up the outline a little bit more, building up some more shading and so forth. And then I'll go in to do the color. But artistically, I almost never designed anything. and to some extent, I'm being a little facetious when I say that. To some extent, it's laziness. To a large extent, though, it's really just about for me, it's about being efficient in my studio. When I say I don't design anything, I mean, I'm not like, people will ask me all the time, well, when am I going to see the drawing? I'm like, well, you're going to see it when I'm done with the tattoo, basically. Like, I'll do basic outline drawings for some of the various elements that I need to collage together to create someone's tattoo. But sleeve projects in particular, which I do a lot of, I'm generally kind of collaging that stuff together as I go. Like, I mean, we have an overall concept that, I'm not just completely pulling everything out of my ass, but largely I pull stuff out of my butt. And But for me, the process of tattooing is no different than the process of creating any other artwork. And that's also goes back to painting, and drawing. Even when I was in art school, when I was teaching painting and drawing, I would see these high school kids come in and they would start to draw exactly the same way that these guys tattoo. Like they'd have an apple or a still life in front of them. They just start at the bottom corner of their paper and they like do everything like perfect, and like not do everything. And I'm like, no, you got to stop. Like you have to work over the whole surface of the canvas, over the whole surface of the image so that you really understand the push and pull between everything. And then you get to make all these different decisions and sort of like every time you put in a color, it changes your idea about what the next color is going to be. And then the next one after that. People always ask me when I'm starting a project and I'm doing all that laying out of the black and gray part, they're like, well, what color is this going to be? What color is that going to be? I'm like, honestly, I have no idea. You're going to come back in a month and we're going to do the color then. And I don't care what color it's going to be. Sometimes like if I'm tattooing an apple on somebody and they've said specifically like, I want a red apple to represent grandmother or whatever it is, of course, we know that's going to be red. But then what I'll do is I'll pour out, 7 to 8 to 10 different colors, everything from like, deep concentrated greens to weird browns to some pale blue. And then, of course, a handful of reds, but then some pinks and some oranges. And they're going to be like, well, what the hell are you doing with all of that? I'm like, I'm making your apple. Like, my apple's supposed to be red. I'm like, yeah, it's going to be red. But have you ever looked at a painting of a red apple? It's 37 different colors, dude. Like, get it right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And that general to specific approach, I think, is a lot more fun and allows for so much more exploration. I've had, going back to that kind of like printer approach that a lot of tattooers have. We actually had, we've had a few kind of realism guys on the show over the years. And just recently, within the last year, we had Nico Hurtado on, and I had the conversation with him where it was like, I don't have a clue what temperature or what color the highlight in that chin is until I've at least addressed the forehead. Like I have to get some type of a base tone in there so that I know like, okay, this is warmer than that. This is probably a little cooler than that. But until the base layers are in there, I don't have a clue how you make those finishing decisions,
But that's the thing is that if you're someone who has done all of this work in Photoshop, you've made all of those decisions in Photoshop. Like you've already made all of those decisions. But when you start tattooing it in like a printer like that, you're absolutely locked into all of those decisions, every single solitary one of them, all the way up. What happens to that guy when he gets halfway through that and he realizes like, oh, that doesn't work. That color doesn't work the same way in this person's skin as it does. Like, oh, that color combination's not going to work out. Like, oh, wait. Like, I planned this whole thing out on my tablet with all this warm color, but now I'm working on this person's skin who's like super olivey, and these warm colors that I have on my iPad actually just look like mud in the wrong kind of sin. Like that's the thing. Like I feel like I have to be able to respond to the drawing and respond to the person's skin or where it's going to go. Things change so much in the course of creating a tattoo.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
So that's, like a lot of that comes from the fact that that's just how I learned to make art from a super early age. Like my brain just doesn't even understand how, like I can't understand how to do that way, like that whole printer thing. And I'm not saying that obviously it's an incredibly effective technique, thousands of tattooers. But again, going back to that whole sort of traditional mindset thing, but the problem that I have with the traditional mindset is simply that people get hung up on this idea that there's one right way to do things. And this is artwork. There's no right way to do things. And by all means, I'm gonna lay out a whole different way of doing things that's very personal to me, but I have no illusions that my way is the right way to do things at all. In fact, I'm pretty sure that my way is the wrong way to do things for probably the majority of tattooers that are out there, And sometimes it's the wrong way for me to do things, even on my own artwork. I'm like, I'll do things my way on someone's tattoo, and then they come back, and I'm like, oh fuck, that didn't work. Well, sit down, let's fix that. Let's get it right the next time. But being open, having different ways of looking at things is the most important part, and that's really what this is all about.
Yeah,
That's the perfect place to sort of like wrap that up.
Yeah.
It's just about being open to creating art in whatever way works for you and for your brain and your way of making art, and not getting locked into anybody's dogma, no matter what the dogma is.
Yeah. And through that, you'll just naturally become a better problem solver over time. And whenever you run it,
Absolutely. The more tools you have in your belt, the better you're going to be as an artist, no matter what you end up doing.
Hey, I want to thank Chris for taking the time. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch or listen. I hope you got something out of that episode. And remember, Chris is going to be teaching a seminar or workshop at the Paradise Tattoo Gathering. So if you are watching this shortly after its release or before October of 2023, then you should definitely make the trip to Jiminy Peak and join us. It's going to be a really, really awesome time. And it is one of the few really art-focused tattoo events that I know of that really just, instead of focusing on just getting out there and doing tattoos all day, it's all about kind of growing our skill sets, learning new things, and then bringing them back and applying them to our work when we get back home. So I hope that you'll join me there. Two things really quickly that I want to mention before we wrap up. One, if you have not already, sign up for our Tattoo Tips Tuesday newsletter. It is free. We don't spam you. Just once a week on Tuesday, you will get some little nugget of information, something from a previous episode. We have so many episodes that it's easy to miss with a lot of the content that we've put out over the years. So this is a great way to just like get bite-sized pieces of content that we've produced over the years. What else? Inside Fireside Tattoo Club is growing steadily. We're up to 40 some odd members now, which is perfect. I love the pace that it's growing. We're getting to know each other really well. If you're looking for a community of tattooers, apprentices, apprentice hopefuls that are going to push you, hold you accountable, help you out when you're hitting drawing struggles, all that kind of stuff. We do drawing nights, we do drawing challenges, we do live critiques, client role play nights, and then of course our biggest thing is the technique talks, where we'll bring in really high level artists from different specialties and just pick their brains. It's basically a podcast with you right beside me asking questions. It's a Zoom call essentially, where we're all going through this person's portfolio, asking questions, and they're giving us feedback. So if you want to get more into technique, like what kind of machines and inks and needles that people are using, how they're reading the skin, what they're doing to prep their designs, consultation stuff, all that, we cover all that stuff in the technique talks. And these are some really high level people. You know, we've had Andy Chambers on this, we've had Euless Blair, Evan Qualls, Patrick Paul O'Neill, and we're doing these every single month. So check out the Inside Fireside Tattoo Club if you have any interest in becoming a stronger tattooer. Thank you, as always, for supporting what we do, and I will see you next time.